Well, that kind of summarizes what our skin obviously does. It's our armor. If we can keep our skin in good shape, we're practically impenetrable from any kind of foreign pathogens that are trying to get access into our body. So, this integumentary system, integument again, as I said, means cover, is going to be our first line of defense. And so, our outermost layer, the epidermis, is mostly composed of dead skin cells, but those dead skin cells can be sloughed off, and that's a protective mechanism as well. And then underneath that epidermis is the live stuff, the dermis layer, where we have our blood vessels, our secretory glands like the sebaceous glands that secrete sebum into the hair follicles and lubricate the hair and lubricate our skin. And then we have the nerve endings, Meissner's corpuscles and such in our dermis layer. So that's where all the real living tissue is. And then beneath that is the adipose layer where we store extra nutrients. And of course, it also helps to act as a body defense. It insulates our body and such as well. But our membranes are also going to be seen throughout our body. And our membranes can be classified as epithelial membranes. They're composed of epithelial tissue and an underlying layer of connective tissue. So epithelial membranes are composed of epithelial tissue. Epithelial tissue is one of the four primary tissue types: epithelial tissue, nerve tissue, muscle tissue, and connective tissue. Those are our four main tissue types. And epithelial membranes are going to have epithelial tissue and connective tissue. Then we have connective tissue membranes, which are largely composed of various types of connective tissue. And so we can see various membranes, epithelial membranes like our mucous membranes. They're going to be lined with mucus secreting cells. They are relatively thin, and they're going to ultimately protect us by having that mucus trap pathogens. And that's how, again, we see that the skin, our integument, and mucous membranes protect us. Then we have connective tissue membranes like the synovial membrane. Synovial membranes are going to be membranes which are part of a joint, and they're going to secrete synovial fluid, and the synovial fluid is going to lubricate joints, and that's going to help our joint glide one bone over another so we have smooth motions. So those are going to be examples of connective tissue membranes. They actually give some stability and rigidity to the joints, but they also secrete synovial membranes and synovial fluid, and those membranes secreting that synovial fluid give those joints a much smoother motion. Epithelial membranes, the cutaneous membrane, okay, that's our skin. Our skin has, many names, the integument or the integumentary system, but we can also call it the cutaneous membrane. Cutaneo is a combining form that means skin, and OUS means pertaining to, so pertaining to the skin. Serous membranes are simple squamous epithelium on a connective tissue basement membrane. And we've already talked about those in the last chapter. We talked about serous membranes in the gastrointestinal tract, but we've also talked about serous membranes when we talked about the pericardium, for example, or the pleural membranes. But our serous membranes are parietal, which line the walls of body cavities, and then the visceral. They cover organs found in the body cavities. So again, just to use this eraser as an example, if this is an organ, the part of the membrane that's right into direct contact with the organ, that's the visceral membrane. And then the part that would go up against a body cavity, the wall of the body cavity, that would be the parietal portion of the membrane. Examples again of our serous membranes include the pleural membrane and the peritoneum. The pleural membrane is the parietal and visceral layers line the walls of the thoracic cavity and cover the lungs. The peritoneum, the parietal and visceral layers line the walls of the abdominal cavity and cover the organs in that cavity. Some diseases associated with pleural membranes: pleurisy, inflammation of the serous membranes that line the chest cavity and cover the lungs. That makes it difficult to breathe. Even just the expansion of the rib cage causes great pain in pleurisy. And then peritonitis, inflammation of the serous membranes in the abdominal cavity that line the walls and cover the abdominal organs. Epithelial membranes, again, mucous membranes are a prevalent example in our body. They line body surfaces that open directly to the exterior world. They produce mucus, a thick secretion that keeps membranes soft and moist, but that mucus also traps pathogens. Connective tissue membranes don't contain epithelial components. They produce a lubricant called synovial fluid, as we'd already talked about. And the examples are the synovial membranes in the spaces between the joints and in the lining of the bursa sacs. Bursa sacs are just going to be sacs of liquid ball bearings, for lack of a better way to put it. Sacs of synovial fluid, which keep connective tissue from coming up against hard bone, which could potentially break the bone down and break the connective tissue down. So it gives the connective tissue something to slide over. The skin. Okay, now we get into the skin itself, the integument or the cutaneous membrane. And its two primary layers are called the epidermis. Epi, of course, means above, so the epidermis and the dermis. The epidermis is the outermost and thinnest primary layer of skin. It's composed of several layers of stratified squamous epithelium. The stratum germinativum is the innermost layer that continually reproduces. New cells move toward the surface. And that little video that I gave you on the skin, and I talked about the skin cells at the stratum germinativum. If we look at the stratum germinativum, we see that the stratum germinativum comes right into contact with the dermis layer. And so what happens is when a skin cell divides into two equal daughter cells, one of those cells makes its way up to the outermost layer of the skin, the stratum corneum, and as it gets farther and farther away from its blood supply in the dermis layer, it fills with keratin, and that keratin basically makes those outermost layers kind of like our armor. So the stratum corneum skin cells are just filled with keratin and nothing else. At that point, really, they're dead. And so that kind of gives our skin a flaky, scaly type appearance if you looked at it under a microscope, or if you've ever held your arm in front of a light and rubbed it real hard and sloughed off the skin. But those keratinized skin cells give us protection from losing water. They give us protection from taking in water if we were to get into a pool, for example. They protect us from abrasions. But again, cells at the stratum germinativum, when a skin cell divides, one cell makes its way towards the surface, then one stays at the stratum germinativum to continually replenish the cells that make up our epidermis. We slough off about 50 million cells a day from the epidermis. Most of your household dust is going to be epidermal cells. So we have to continually replenish their numbers. As cells approach the surface, they're filled with a tough waterproof protein called keratin, as we just mentioned a second ago, and eventually the cells flake off. The outermost layer of our skin is the stratum corneum. Okay, and again, that's the layer composed of about 20 to 40 layers of dead skin cells. Skin pigment, the deepest epidermal cells, deepest epidermal layers responsible for the production of pigment, which gives color to the skin. Okay, we call that pigment melanin, and the cells that secrete the pigment, we call those melanocytes. Now, the melanocytes, as well as keratin that we get through our diet, and the blood in our dermis layer, that's what actually gives our skin its color. If somebody doesn't have good oxygenated blood, Arterial blood has a rosy glow to it due to the hemoglobin if it's well oxygenated. If somebody has poorly oxygenated blood, they take on a grayish or even a bluish color. They're cyanotic, in other words, and that's because they don't have good oxygenation of the hemoglobin in the red blood cells, and that actually changes the hue of the skin. So the pigment melanin from the melanocytes is mostly responsible for our skin color, but also, like I said, the pigment keratin that we get in through our diet. People think of keratin being from keratin, I should say, from carrots, for example. We get it from there, obviously, but it contributes to our skin color as well as the oxygenated red blood cells. The hemoglobin has a red glow to it. Blisters. If somebody gets a blister, there's actually a breakdown of the union between the cells in the epidermis and the dermis. What happens is the epidermis literally separates from the dermis in a blister. That's why they tell you not to pop a blister, because if you just let it come back together on its own, the epidermis and the dermis will actually start to heal back together. So here we can see the dermis and the epidermis. The epidermis here in pink and then the dermis here in the blue. They can actually pull apart when somebody gets a blister. But again, rather than popping the blister, if the two are allowed to heal, they will heal back together. Okay. The dermal epidermal junction. It's a specialized area between the two skin layers. Okay. So again, this is our epidermis here in the pink. Okay, in the blue is the dermis. Okay, here we can actually see on this particular diagram a flaked cell from the stratum corneum. But ultimately, we can see that there is a unification of the epidermis and the dermis. Whoops. And that's what we call the dermal epidermal junction. Now, the dermis itself, deeper and thicker of the two primary skin layers and composed largely of connective tissue. The upper papillary level of the dermis is characterized by parallel rows of tiny bumps called the dermal papilla. That's what gives us our fingerprints. The ridges and grooves in the dermis form a unique pattern to each individual. That's the basis for fingerprinting. It also improves our grip. The dermal papilla that are on our fingers, okay, that gives us a better grip, and on our feet, that gives us better traction for walking. The deeper reticular layer of the... Go ahead, I'm sorry. Yeah, go ahead. Uh-huh.
Where we get the where they get the fingerprints from.
Yes.
So now I just was watching TV, so I just want to make sure that this is true. So if a person burns their fingers, the fingertips, or the skin on their fingers, or takes it off, they no longer have fingerprints.
Yeah. Yeah, that's quite a process, but if I understand right, a lot of undercover types and such, like CIA operatives or Israeli Mossad agents or something like that, will do that. So yeah, that is actually possible. But you've got to burn through all your epidermis down to the dermis layer. Uh-huh.
So, wait a minute. So you trying to tell me, but never mind. That's right. I don't want to know anything else. But
Sure.
Somebody in the class was showing us a before picture and after,
Uh-huh.
and I didn't really see the need, but since they showed it to me, I want to ask you a question. Can you tell us, because there's a few of us in here thinking about getting lap band now since you saw the picture. Can you tell us about it?
The lap band procedure?
Is that healthy for us?
Sure. A lot of people will get that. It's a better alternative for most than, say, a bariatric procedure where they actually resection the stomach and leave you with just a very small pouch. Remember those rugae in the stomach? I talked about how they can stretch out like an accordion, and that's how most people end up gaining their weight back after they've gone through a bariatric procedure like that, a gastric bypass, in other words, because they can stretch those rugae out and get the stomach back to where it'll hold roughly the same amount that it did before. And so that's why a lot of people are not successful unless they really learn to overhaul their diet and exercise and so on and so forth. Now, the lap band procedure is a lot more reversible. It doesn't have to be permanent because literally it's a band that's put around the stomach, and it kind of accomplishes the same thing as resectioning the stomach and just creating a very small pouch, like the bariatric gastric bypass procedure would do. Now, the drawback to any of those weight loss surgeries, it kind of goes. If we look at this particular slide here, we can see we've got the epidermis and then the dermis layer, and then beneath that, of course, is the subcutaneous layer or the fat layer. And it forms a superficial fascia, as it's called. Fascia is tough connective tissue found in our joints and throughout our muscles, and it's going to surround our muscles. But we also have that adipose layer that kind of forms a scaffolding on top of our muscles to support the skin. And when we have a large amount of fat in that adipose layer, and you do lose that weight, and so you lose a lot of the fat, well, now, unfortunately, that epidermis and dermis layer have been stretched out, and the fat's been lost, but that skin is no longer taut because there's just not as much fat underneath the epidermis and dermis to keep it stretched out taut. And so that's why the people that do lose a significant amount of weight after a procedure like a gastric bypass or a lap band procedure, they do have that extra skin that they have to deal with in some cases, depending on how much they had to lose and how slowly it came off. Sure. To some extent, it just depends. If you lost a very large amount of weight, you're not going to be able to tighten it up, but so much. You can increase your muscle size, and that would help a lot in tightening up the skin. But the thing of it is, though, is that chances are, muscle is so compact. Like a pound of muscle is only about the size of a deck of cards. It is very compact. And so it's difficult to expand muscle mass that much to, kind of stretch the skin back out and make it taut again after losing a significant amount of weight. So usually the patients that undergo a radical procedure like that end up having to have some sort of a procedure, a reduction procedure to get rid of extra skin if they've lost enough weight. Yeah, because exercise and everything will help, but it can only go so far.
So they just have to cut the skin off and you donate it to somebody, right?
You know what? That's a good question. I don't know about that. I don't see why you couldn't, though. I mean, they do. They do donations from people for skin. They can even do cadaver and stuff like that in some cases. So that I don't know. I honestly do not know the answer to that, but I don't see why you wouldn't be able to. Surely if somebody was a correct match, it could be done. I mean, my Lord, some of these people that get horribly burned, yeah, that would be a great option for them. So, yeah, but I don't honestly know about that. That's really interesting. I'll have to do some research on that.
Okay. Want to know.
Well,
In
let's
case I had,
see.
just like about 100 extra pounds laying around somewhere. That will have to donate to somebody. Who doesn't need to lose 100 pounds? Oh, you gotta be kidding me. It's in a lot of hidden compartments. In this house, there's a lot of hidden compartments that you don't want to know about. Remember that story you told us about the bathroom?
Okay, so getting back to okay, so getting back to our dermis layer, the dermis layer, we've got a deep reticular layer that has a interlacing layers of collagen. And collagen are stretchable, elastic fibers. That's what gives our skin the ability to snap back. If we take our skin and pinch it up, it'll snap back because of the collagen. And ultimately, when somebody starts to have wrinkles, it's because the number of the elastic fibers decreases with age and contributes to the patient having wrinkles. The dermis also contains nerve endings, muscle fibers. Those are called the erector pili muscles that can make the hair follicles stand up. If somebody ever goes to a haunted house and they're like, oh my gosh, that scared me so much, all the hair on the back of my neck standing up. That's because the erector pili muscles can literally pull on a hair follicle and make it stand up. We also have sweat and sebaceous glands in the dermis layer. Sweat glands, of course, are going to help cool the integumentary system. And since our blood is so close to the surface of the integument, when we cool the surface of our integument, that in turn cools the blood in the dermis layer, and that cooled blood gets carried throughout the rest of the body, cooling off the entire body. We also have sebaceous glands that secrete sebum. Sebum lubricates our hair. It also makes its way to the skin surface. Therefore, it gets our skin nice and lubed up and soft as well. And then we have blood vessels in that dermis layer too, because those blood vessels are so close to the surface. Again, they can help in temperature regulation. Accessory structures to the skin include the hair. We have the soft hair of the fetus and the newborn is called lunago. Hair growth requires epidermal tube-like structures called the hair follicle. And again, that's going to be in the dermis is where the hair follicle originates. Hair growth begins from what's called the hair papilla. And then the hair root lies hidden in a follicle, and the visible part of the hair is called the shaft. Okay, and there we talk about the erector pili muscles, the specialized muscle group that produces goosebumps and causes the hair to stand up straight. Okay, so here we see a slide with our hair follicle. And here we can see the papilla. And then this is going to be the entire hair follicle. And we can see it's richly vascular. Here's the erector pili muscle that's going to be important for making that hair follicle stand erect. If it's cold, that's what gives us our goosebumps, for example, or if you get scared. We see a sebaceous gland that's going to secrete sebum, and that's going to, again, lubricate the skin, lubricate the hair. We also have receptors in our dermis. These are specialized nerve endings that make it possible for skin to act as a sense organ. We have Meissner's corpuscles, which are capable of detecting light touch. And then we have Pacini corpuscles, which are capable of detecting pressure. For example, if I tie my shoes real tight first thing in the morning, the Pacini corpuscles detect that pressure. Meissner's corpuscle, though, capable of detecting light touch. That gives us the tactile receptors that give us the capability to thread a needle, for example. Okay, then we come to the nails. They're produced by the epidermal cells over the terminal ends of the fingers and the toes. The visible part's called the nail body. Okay, so there we can see the nail body. And then the root lies in a groove and is hidden by the cuticle. Okay, so this is the root and it's hidden by the cuticle. Cutto is a combining form that also means skin. Ickle is a suffix that means small, so that's literally the little skin. Covers the hair, or excuse me, the nail root. The crescent-shaped area nearest the root is called the lunula. Okay, so there's the lunula, the half-moon shape. And then the nail bed may change color with change in blood flow. Whoops. Okay. So this is our nail. Of course, it's going to be the same with our phalanges of our toes as well as the phalanges that we consider our fingers. In the dermis layer, we also have glands. They are sweat glands. They're also called pseudoiferous glands and sebaceous glands. And again, they secrete sebum. The sweat or the pseudoiferous glands, we have two types. They're the eccrine sweat glands, are the most numerous. They are the most widespread of the sweat glands. They produce perspiration, and it's going to help in regulation of our body temperature. We have also the apocrine sweat glands. And the apocrine sweat glands, I always think to myself, a way to remember the apocrine sweat glands is they make you smell bad like an ape. Ape apocrine. But they're found in the axilla and the genitalia. And so that's why I kind of think of them as the apocrine sweat glands, make you smell like an ape. But they're going to be found in the axilla, and that's when it mixes with bacteria that are on your skin naturally, that's what produces body odor. So the apocrine sweat glands produce a thicker, more viscous sweat, and it's not really as essential for cooling the body as the eccrine sweat glands are. Okay. Our sebaceous glands are going to secrete the oil or sebum for the hair and the skin, and the level of secretion increases during adolescence, and that's what leads to a lot of kids getting acne. And the amount of secretion is regulated by sex hormones. Kids start getting hormonal, as they call them, in their early teenage years, and that again leads to an increase in sebum secretion. And sebum in sebaceous gland ducts may darken to form blackheads. That's also the perfect breeding ground for bacteria that lives on our skin to start to proliferate, and that's what also leads to acne vulgaris or pimples. So a blackhead is just where the sebum comes into contact with air and sticks around in the duct and forms a blackhead. But acne vulgaris or pimples, that's where that bacteria that's always on our skin, our normal flora, comes into contact with that moist, warm sebum, and it proliferates. It causes an infection in that hair follicle, and that's what leads to a zit, for lack of a better way to put it. Now, skin cancer. Skin cancer, of course, is going to be broken down into squamous cell carcinoma, basal cell carcinoma, malignant melanoma, and Kaposi sarcoma. And those are going to be seen in HIV patients. The causes for skin cancer, there can be a genetic predisposition. The sun's ultraviolet radiation damages the skin cells' DNA, causing mistakes during cell division or mitosis. That's probably the most common thing. Excessive UV exposure. Okay. And so here we have the various types of skin cancer. Whoops. Squamous cell carcinoma, okay, is letter A. And then a basal cell carcinoma, letter B. C, malignant melanoma, okay, and we know that by the ABCDs. Okay, it's asymmetrical, the borders are uneven, the color of it is multiple colors. We see some brown, we see some black, we might even see a little bit of purple in there, and then the diameter of it, okay, large in diameter, and if it's grown, that is, something that needs to be managed in a very orderly and quick process. And then finally, D, Kaposi sarcoma, again, which is often seen in people who are immunocompromised, like patients that have HIV that has now manifested as AIDS. Squamous cell carcinoma is a common type of skin cancer. It's slow growing. The lesions begin as painless, hard, raised nodules, and they will metastasize. Of course, metastasize means to spread. Okay, so this was our squamous cell carcinoma. Basal cell is the most common type of skin cancer. It originates in cells at the base of the epidermis, often on the upper face. The lesions begin as small raised areas that erode in the center and bleed and crust over. Whoops. Okay, and so here we see, daggone it, basal cell carcinoma. Okay, they are less likely to metastasize. Then we get to malignant melanoma, which is the most serious form of skin cancer. Malignant melanoma only occurs in about 5% of the total types of skin cancer, but it is the one that has the highest mortality rate. And so, letter C there is our malignant melanoma. And it's the most serious of the skin cancers that may develop from benign pigmented moles or excess UV radiation. Obviously, in this country, the incidence in the United States is increasing, and you have to follow the ABCD rule of self-examination. Okay, so there's our ABCD rule. Asymmetry. Benign moles are usually symmetrical. Their halves are mirror images of each other. Melanoma lesions are asymmetrical or lopsided. Border. Benign moles are outlined by a distinct border, but malignant melanoma lesions are often irregular or indistinct in shape. Color. Benign moles may be any shade of brown, but are relatively evenly colored. Melanoma lesions tend to be unevenly colored, exhibiting a mixture of shades or colors. Diameter. By the time a melanoma lesion exhibits characteristics A, B, and C, it's also probably larger than 6 millimeters. So again, the diameter overall, once it goes 6 millimeters and beyond, then it again is something to be gravely concerned about. Function to the skin, of course, it serves as our armor, protection. It's our first line of defense against infections by microbes. The melanocytes give us protection from UV radiation. It gives us protection from harmful chemicals and cuts and tears. It helps us with temperature regulation. The skin can release almost 3,000 calories of body heat per day. The mechanisms of temperature regulation include the regulation of sweat secretion and the regulation of flow of blood close to the body's surface. If I'm really hot, I can release more blood flow to the surface in that dermis layer, and as those pseudoiferous glands secrete their sweat onto the skin surface and the sweat evaporates out into the atmosphere, it cools the skin. And because the body's released more blood into that dermis layer, that blood in turn gets cooled as well. Thus, as that blood gets circulated throughout the body, the core of the body becomes cooler, and that helps us to dissipate the heat. The skin also acts as a sense organ. Okay, again, the skin is our largest organ. The sheer surface area of it and all of the receptors associated with the skin give us an enormous tactile presence. So receptors serve as receivers for the body, keeping it informed of changes in its environment. Okay, burns. We talked about skin cancer as being something which is obviously detrimental to the skin, but burns also can do great damage to the skin. Treatment and recovery or survival depend on total body area involved and the severity or depth of the burn. Body surface area is estimated using the rule of 9 in adults. The body is divided into 11 areas of 9% each. An additional 1% is located around the genitals. So when we look at a diagram and talk about the rule of nines, the front and the back of the head, that comprises 9% of the body surface area. Okay, and there we see that the anterior surfaces of each arm would be 4.5%. The back of it would be 4.5%. So there's 9. Okay, the anterior surface, the chest and the abdominal region, that is 18%. So that's 2 sections of 9. And in the back, the dorsum, okay, 18% as well. Okay, the back of each lower leg is 9%. The front of each lower leg, 9%. Okay, but add all of that together plus the 1% for the genitalia region, that gives us 100% of our total body surface area. And the rule of 9 is going to be important in determining treatment for severe burns. Obviously, a first-degree burn might be something like a sunburn, and all it really is a little bit tender and warm to the touch, and discolored. It would be red. But a second-degree burn is where we have blistering. But a third-degree burn is obviously the type of burn that we're really concerned with, and that's where the rule of 9 really plays a big role in treatment, because a third-degree burn is going to be a burn through the epidermis, dermis layers, and potentially through the adipose layer and even into the muscle, and in some severe cases down to the bone. And depending on how much surface area of the body is affected, that's where the rule of 9 comes into play, as to how the patient is going to be treated, mostly in terms of rehydration. It's not infection that's the worst fear of somebody with a severe burn. It's actually dehydration. And dehydration has to be countered because the human body is almost 70% water. And so it has to be accounted for in a very rapid succession, or the patient will dehydrate and die. And so how much surface area has been damaged by a severe burn gives the physician the amount of fluid that must be replenished in the body in a timely fashion. So again, here's our classification of burns. First degree is just a partial thickness burn, only the surface layers of the epidermis. Second degree, partial thickness, involves the deep epidermal layers and always cause injury to the upper layers of the dermis. Okay, again, we see blistering. And that's similar to a blister that we might get as a friction blister, where the epidermis and the dermis pull apart. But finally, third degree is the full thickness burn, characterized by complete destruction of the epidermis and dermis. It may involve underlying muscle and bone. A lesion is insensitive to pain because of the destruction of nerve endings immediately after injury. Intense pain is soon experienced. Remember, the dermis layer contains the Pacini corpuscles, the Meissner's corpuscles, those nerve endings. And so when somebody initially has a severe burn, those are all destroyed. And so there will be a lack of feeling. But peripheral nerves can regenerate. Unlike nerves of the central nervous system, which can't, peripheral nerves can regenerate. So when they do regenerate, they are incredibly sensitive, and that's what gives patients with severe burns all of that pain. There is definitely a risk of infection associated with severe burns. Like I said, it's not the first concern for the physician, but once dehydration has been managed, then it is of great concern. Okay, and there are some examples of burn. The first one is just simply a sunburn, most likely. The second one, we can actually see the blistering of the skin, and then the third one we see, in this case, charring of the skin, discoloration due to the intensity of the burn and the depth of the burn. Okay. All right, does anybody have any questions associated with the integumentary system?